We're going to start just as a practice together that Rachel will lead, and then we'll have a time we'll just go around the circle and talk about how we experienced the practice.
Thank you. So why don't we just sit quietly, feeling the weight of our body in the chair, feet on the floor, and hands however is comfortable for you, eyes closed. Thank you. So why don't we just sit quietly, feeling the weight of our body in the chair, feet on the floor, and hands however is comfortable for you, eyes closed through your mouth, making your exhale longer than your inhale. So breathing in through your nose, hold a moment, exhale through your mouth. And as you do that one more time, just pay attention to that breath. Allow the breath to take you into checking in with yourself. Thanking Trinity for your breath, your heart that beats, acknowledging that your heart is also a place where you know love, where you receive love, where you give love. Being thankful again for your brain that allows you to think. So what you have there is a heart that beats, lungs that breathe, and a brain that thinks. You might become aware even of your thoughts or some internal dialogue that you're having or a feeling state that you may be in. Whatever is happening inside you, just bring some awareness to it. Don't judge it or try to change it or fix it. Just try to see it. And as you keep your attention on your breathing and sensing, I'm going to pray a prayer. Eternal Spirit, Earth Maker, Pain Bearer, Life Giver, Source of all that is and that shall be, Father and Mother of us all, loving God, in whom is heaven. The hallowing of your name echoes through the universe. The way of your justice be followed by the peoples of the world. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. In the hurts we absorb from one another, forgive us. In times of temptation and test, strengthen us. From trials too great to endure, walk with us through them. From the grip of all that is evil, free us. For you reign in the glory of the power That is love, now and forever. Amen. Bring your awareness back into the room and back to each other. I want to take us through a spiritual locating exercise. And all a locating exercise is designed to do today is help you notice where you are. And it becomes for us a way of noticing. And we'll do it in 6 movements. And movements are nothing but 6 questions. Answer the questions in short statements, short sentences, and then we'll have time of reflection. But answer them as you hear them, answer, and then we'll move on. So the first movement is, in this place of being with Trinity, how are you coming today in the particulars of your life? And that's just the distinctives of your life. So in this place of being with Trinity, how are you coming today in the particulars of your life? Movement 2, more specifically in this season of your life, what are your preoccupations? What do you find yourself thinking about? What are the preoccupations of your life? What do you find yourself most thinking about? The third movement is staying with this season of your life. What are the dominant emotions you are experiencing? What are the dominant emotions you are experiencing? The fourth movement, and being intentional about not judging or moralizing, just noticing in this season of your life, how are you feeling in your body? Just notice, how are you feeling in your body? The fifth movement, in this season of your life, what are the questions you're holding? In the sixth movement, in this season of your life, what do you want? What desires are you noticing? What do you want? What desires are you noticing? So now we'll take a minute to carefully look over the questions and your responses. Go through the movements and answer the question, where am I now? How is God with me now? And is there an invitation from the Father. Looking at the questions and your responses. Where am I now? How is God with me now? And is there an invitation from the Father? So let's just take a whole minute with that. So as I mentioned when we began, this is just to notice, something to pay attention to, not judge, not criticize. It allows you to see what's being revealed to you and help you locate where you currently are. Noticing what's true. Noticing your whole being, your emotions, your body, your thinking. And may I bless you. I bless that all that Trinity has stirred in you in this time. I bless your noticing to keep it real and to just stay. Noticing the edge of cliff experiences that bring joy and adventure, yet a sense of trust. Trust in where this will take you. Trust with how you will land. I bless just being with Trinity and the peace and rest that that brings. I bless being settled and content and celebrating the shalomity, I think is what I heard, how I heard it. But I bless that. Bless that. And even as you live in the contradictions, the both ands, I bless that time because God is near. The God of hope walks with you. The God of peace, the God of joy. May you experience him in the fullest way possible in your own life experiences as you continue to notice. In the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit, amen.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was great. Very
Thank
coming
you.
into the present. I'd like to invite Jimmy Dodd to share next. He's going to share about his ministry as a strategic partner for us in our ministries.
All right, I'll go very, very quickly here. First of all, it's just great to be on. I think I know a few of you. I know a few of you well, so it's just great to be on with you here this morning. So I pastored for about 18 years, pastored in Chicago, Boston, South Carolina, then did a church plant in Kansas City in 1992. Things went very well at the church plant, and people made big assumptions about me. They assumed because I had a really strong front stage that things must be really healthy on my backstage. And that's a bad assumption. That's a bad assumption that we make all the time because I didn't have a healthy backstage. I was very insecure. Found very much my self-worth in the church, found my self-worth in people liking me. So I didn't have the right balance of life and marriage and parenting and everything else, and really hit a crisis point in about 1997. Reached out to some just some very dear friends who really spoke the gospel to me, and as a result of that, it's a long story, but we launched PastorServe in the 1999 because we just felt like there was a need for a ministry that would care for pastors, um, in the midst of just all of life's challenges that they face. Because as we all know, pastors face the same things that everybody else has faced. Yet oftentimes a lot of pastors feel like there's no safe, confidential, gospel-centric place. We hear from pastors all the time that I have a fear that if I was completely honest with my board or my session or my district, whoever it might be, or my bishop, that I think that they might fire me. Um, and I really don't feel like I can be completely open and honest about everything in my life. So we have a strong vision, and that's just to make sure that no pastor walks alone. We have found that there is just tremendous big challenges with pastors as far as isolation. We know that there are lots of pastors that are surrounded by people in some very big churches who are completely isolated. And so we know that just because there is a strong front stage in a pastor's life, maybe a growing church or all these other things, that does not mean that their backstage is in order. And so we really want to do everything we can to strengthen the church by serving pastors and ministry leaders. So the main two things that we do, we connect pastors and we care for pastors. That's really what we do. We connect them and care for them. And we really work in that area in four main ways. We have cohorts that we lead. We have pastoral cohorts across the country. That we do a lot of coaching of pastors. You coach pastors from every tribe and denomination across the entire board. We do a lot of consulting, and really that means that we do a lot of soul care for church staffs. For we do a lot of staff retreats. I've worked very closely with Lou over the years because we do a lot of soul care for his team. We have a great podcast that's very much about soul care. That's called Front Stage Backstage. It's with a guy on our staff. His name is Jason Day, who does a phenomenal job. And then we do a lot of crisis care. And the crisis care is really kind of two things. It's those that are in the midst of a really hard place because of just like a bad decision. It could be an affair, it could be pornography, it could be addictions, all sorts of things. But we also work with pastors in the midst of natural disasters. So we have worked very closely with pastors after Harvey and Katrina and the Joplin tornado and wildfires. I could go on and on. And so what we have a very strong belief that pastors that we have worked with that are really healthy and really kind of seem to be in a good place have got six really key relationships in their life. They have a boss, a trainer, a coach, a counselor, a mentor, and a friend. And I can send everybody just some brief statements about everything I've said about these things. But we have found that those are really the key relationships. That does not have to be six people. That could be four people, because I think that you can be a boss and a friend. I think that you can be a counselor and I think a mentor. I think that you can be a coach and a friend. I think it's very hard to be a boss and a counselor. I think that oftentimes does not work well, but that doesn't mean you have to have six people. And so we have staff all over the country. At the very start of PastorServe, we made a very strong commitment that we will not be a white, male, large church, suburban pastor's ministry. And so we made a strong commitment to serve the whole church. We have African American on staff, we have Hispanic, we have Haitian, we have Korean, we have white, obviously. So it's a very broad staff, very diverse staff. We've got lots of strong men, lots of strong women, from lots of different tribes across the country. And so it would be a joy for us to help out in any way. So those who have received the grant at Lilly, we have worked very closely with Lou. We've worked with the folks up at Our Daily Bread that they got a grant. We're working very closely with them. So if there's any way that we could help out in any way, we'd be honored. So less than 6 minutes. There you go, Kim.
Nice. I would invite you to also, if you want to just send a reply to the email. I
Yeah,
think you have
sure.
everybody, and you
I
can
can do
just
it.
send resources, how to get a hold of you.
Great.
And then we have added you to our strategic partner list where people can just, whenever they want to,
Thank you,
connect
Kim.
up with
Very
you.
appreciated.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Lou and Richard, and Lou's going to kind of introduce Richard, and he's going to take it away.
Oh, I'm so pleased to introduce Richard Clinton to this group. Richard has a long history of serving church communities through research and teaching and practical life. He's been a part of our Thriving in Ministry program. We end ours, our last retreat is on finishing well. And Richard's book, one of his books, Finishing Well, has just been a key for us. So I'm very thankful for that. I would say Richard is a great golfer also. I am really envious of how well he plays golf and recently moved to really a golf mecca in the United States into North Carolina. What's the town, Richard? I blanked on it.
Pinehurst.
Pinehurst, yeah, gets to play those incredible courses. So, Richard, thank you for joining with us and sharing this morning with us, and blessings on you.
Hey, thank you, Lou. I'll take a few minutes just to kind of share a little bit about how we help leaders. When I looked at the topic that you have raised for this group, talking about spiritual, mental health over time, basically, I joined my father almost 40 years ago. Well, I joined him a lot older. I'm 65 this week, so joined him 65 years ago. But in terms of ministry, a little bit more than 40 years ago. And we've been working together for most of that time to try to help leaders and to try to strengthen leaders. My father's Dr. J. Robert Clinton. Most people have heard of him in some way. And he was a professor at Fuller for many, many decades, and has mostly worked in the academic world. And I worked mostly in the local church world. So we kind of would join together to help leaders. And our assumption is been this, that if a leader is closely aligning themselves with God's plan for their life, they're going to be healthier. They're going to be better. And so what we've really focused in on, the niche that we have is not unique to us, but it's just, we work in the niche of personal leadership development. And this is kind of where we have focused. And so I just want to give you a little overview of how we help leaders and what we do. And then you'll have some time to ask questions and things like that. But before I jump into that, I want you just to imagine, Laura and I took one of our favorite vacations not too long ago. We were in Oregon. And have you ever been to Oregon, driving along the coast of Oregon? That road is amazing. But there's a lot of times when you're high up off the ocean and you're on the cliffside and you're meandering in and around. I want you just to picture that kind of a road at the moment. And I want you to imagine just cruising along, enjoying the beauty and all that. And then what you don't know is right around the next corner, there's a mudslide that's happened, and it's washed out the bridge that connects the two sides of a very deep ravine. And I want you to imagine the difference between driving around that corner and knowing the bridge is washed out versus driving around that corner and not knowing. And you can just imagine those scenarios. Another thing I want you to imagine is just think back over your life at things that have been surprising to you in ministry, or things that the difference between, say, surprise and anticipation or expectation. And, most of us, it's been my observation in my own life, and I think many leaders I've worked with, that we don't do real well when we're surprised. we react in those moments, and whatever that reaction is not always the one that we want to have. And so with those two little images in your mind, you'll understand what it is that we try to do to help leaders, and that we come alongside and we offer them perspective on the journey, the leadership journey they're on with God. And we offer them perspective that comes out of nearly 40 years of leadership research now. Lou mentioned that my dad is a world-class researcher and organizer. He was an electrical engineer by training. And so when he began to research, he had one question that he began to look at closely. And that was, how does God develop a leader? How does God make a leader? And so he began to look at that question, because the belief and conviction that we have coming out of Ephesians 2:10 is that God has a unique plan for each one of us. That he has known well before we even existed. And he's in that verse 2:10, Ephesians 2:10 says he's handcrafting us, shaping us so that we can accomplish the things that he's designed for us to do. And so we really believe that everyone has a unique plan. And what we try to do is come alongside leaders and help them figure out what that plan is, what God's plan for your life is, and help you align yourself with God's plan. And that will give you a healthier, more balanced, closer walk with God along the way. So that's kind of what we've tried to do all this time. The research methodology really comes out of what we call a leadership mandate in Hebrews 13:7-8, which says, look back at the leaders who have gone before you, observe their lives, learn from their lives, imitate the things that you see that are God honoring in their lives. For Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Those are those two verses there at the end of Hebrews. And so our expectation is, if we can learn from those who went before us, well, our expectation is that Jesus is still developing leaders in the same way now, and will in what is the future for us as well. And so that was kind of the impetus between how we went after trying to learn how God develops leaders. And so we used a methodology, comes out of social theory, social research theory, in which we began to do comparative studies, leader A to leader B, leader A, leader B to leader C, and so forth and so on. I think now we quit counting somewhere around 5,000 or 6,000 leadership case studies. I can't remember. We're probably somewhere closer to 8,000 to 10,000 now. And we basically are asking the question in every leader's life, how did God work in your life? How did God develop these things in you? And so we began to look for patterns. We began to look for things that were similar. We began to look for, how does God do it? When does God do it? What's the best response? And so out of all of that research the data began to pile up. And my dad's unique giftedness, he began as an electrical engineer. So he began to organize all this data into what he calls leadership emergence theory. And so I joined him right after he first published his leadership emergence theory. And we're continuing to do research right up until today. And we're learning about how God works in the life of a leader and how God develops leaders. And we've learned a lot along the way by looking at the leaders who have gone before us. We've studied all the biblical leaders. We've studied, somewhere between 200 and 300 historical leaders through biographies and things like that. And then the vast majority of the case studies have been we just call contemporary leaders. Those are students that have studied with us, people that we've coached, people that we've mentored, come alongside, and asking the questions of what's God doing in your life? How is God doing it? And those kinds. Does that make sense to you? If I'm talking too fast or too much, I'm trying to simplify it greatly. But and so basically with this in mind, we began to compile all of this data with simply one goal in mind: to help leaders get perspective on what God's doing in their life. And not only by looking back, you can see the finger of God tracing through your life, giving them perspective on where they are right now, and then helping them anticipate where God is leading them and how God will get them from point A to point B. What are the kinds of things that God does to shape leaders? And so that's what all of this data helps us to do that. And so we use these three, we call it three variables. How God uses time is the first one. We've developed a lot of tools related around timelines, which help leaders understand the basic phases of development that occur over a life. We've seen those patterns over and over, so we've labeled them and talked about them and how long they take and about when they occur and all that stuff. So we can plot every leader that we talk with and work with, we can figure out about where they are in their development, which gives them a lot of perspective and understanding on what's happening to them right now. The other thing we do is we help them understand and learn to recognize how God works in the life of a leader. What kinds of stuff does God do? What kind of things does God use? And how does he process or shape leaders across their lifetime? And so we've identified a whole bunch of those things that help give leaders perspective. And most of the time when we share all that kind of stuff with leaders, they'll go, oh, well, now that makes sense. Now I understand what I couldn't get it before, but now it's starting to make more sense. And then the third thing is that we help them understand what is the most God-honoring response to these things that are happening. How do we make choices to align ourselves in ways that will be more pleasing to God? And so we kind of help leaders get oriented in terms of the response. So that's in a nutshell, that's the emergence theory that we use. And we've taught it we use this in almost every kind of presentation format you can imagine. We've taught it in seminary courses. We've taught it in graduate programs. We've taught it at retreat settings. We teach it one-on-one with people individually, coaching, consulting, mentoring. We've taught it in just about everywhere in almost every culture of the world, because the cultures of the world gathered around Fuller Seminary. We've seen this theory work to help leaders in every continent, in every place. It spans across gender, it spans across cultures, it spans across all kinds of things. And so it's just helping people learn to see and get perspective. Does that kind of make sense to you? And so that's what we do to help leaders. And those kind of, I just want to mention a couple things that relate specifically to the topic that you're working in. One thing that we see over and over again is that when leaders look back across their life with some understanding of how God works in the life of a leader, what God does when and how he shapes and processes, so many times there's powerful healing that gets released in that process. They kind of reinterpret their past. They reinterpret it by seeing it from the viewpoint of God, if that makes sense. And that can be so healing and freeing. They don't get stuck, so to say, in what happened to them or the way it happened to them. They begin to see God's use of it. And you think about what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 1:3-5. Praise be to the God of all comfort, who comforts us let me paraphrase this, in the yucky stuff that happens to us, so that we might in turn give that same comfort that God gave to us to others who need it. It's a very loose paraphrase, but you understand it. And so we begin to see how God uses things, even things that were not good, things that were maybe even sinful or evil that were done against us. God can redeem those things and use them as he meets us in them. And so first thing we see is a lot of healing. And I know that they're in the group in PastorServe, that's part of what you're helping leaders do is get in touch with what is God doing and making sense. And there's so much healing that comes when leaders realize, hey, I'm not the only one that this has ever happened to or whatever. And then a second thing that really helps leaders is is they learn how to recognize the finger of God in their present situations. So they learn to recognize more quickly when God is involved in something and what God is doing and what would be the best way to respond. In fact, we teach people, because we can anticipate pretty well the kinds of things that happen to leaders across a lifetime and about when they happen. And you can anticipate those things happening, and you can prepare for those things ahead of time. My dad uses this weird term called life scheduling. And he says, basically, you know that things are like, for example, conflict is going to happen. Conflict is going to happen to every leader, or criticism or these kind of things. And when you're aware of that, you're not surprised by it. And you can choose ahead of time how you're going to respond in terms of what's going to guide you through those situations, if that makes sense to you. And I know I'm kind of like a fire hydrant a little bit. I'm just pouring all this stuff out, but this is how we try to help leaders. And then one of the things that, let me just, Lou mentioned this. This is one of the things I do with Lou's group when we come together in these cohorts that he's running. He asked me, would you focus on the finishing well idea? Back at the very beginning of researching leadership and how God works in the leader's life, my dad did a Bible study on the leaders in the Bible and simply asked the question, how did the leaders finish in the biblical narratives and the stories that we have? And if you look, there's thousands of leaders mentioned by name in the Bible. Most of them are in big, long lists of clan leaders and all these things. So we don't really know what happened to them. But of the leaders that we have information of, there's about 49 of them that we can tell how they finished. The story tells us how they ended. And it's interesting to note that, and it's a little bit subjective, but when you look at those 49 leaders, only about a third of them finish well, which is a little surprising. If I were God writing a book that's meant to inspire leaders for the rest of time, I might put a little bit more encouraging stories in there. And you wonder, why did God inspire the book and put so many of these stories in there? Now we know from what Paul writes to the Corinthian church that these things, and to the Roman church, these things were written down for us as warnings. They're kind of like the guy that's standing there on the edge of that road along the cliff sides in Oregon, waving a sign saying, slow down, watch out. It's, don't go speeding around this corner. And in a little bit, that's why these stories are there. And so when my dad did the original Bible study, he said, well, what can we learn from this? What can we learn from the biblical stories? And so we began to ask those questions, looking, and so one of the first questions that we asked was, well, what does a good finish look like? And so we identified 6 characteristics of what does it look like when a leader is finishing well. And we talk about those 6 characteristics. We also asked the question, what does it look like? What is it that stops leaders from finishing well? What is it that blocks them or hinders them? And we know the Bible tells us that the enemy is seeking like a roaring lion to devour leaders and to try to block them from being obedient to God. So we know that we have the resistance that is fighting against God's purposes and plans. And to be honest, when you look at what happens to leaders in the Bible, you could probably make your own list. Most people, when I ask them the question, why don't leaders finish well? What blocks or hinders them? They can come up with the list pretty quick. And the enemy doesn't have to be all that creative. And so we identified, the major barriers that block. And so we first identified 6, and then we added, the practitioners, we added who are out there teaching this stuff, we added a couple more along the way to my dad's original 6. But you can guess what they are, what kind of blocks leaders from finishing well. And I'm sure that PastorServe's probably got their own list of what blocks leaders, we all know. And so we looked at that kind of things, like what blocks leaders, and just knowing that this stuff is there, it's clear warnings, and leaders just being aware gives them a better chance of navigating these things that the enemy is going to throw at us. And so we just kind of outline those things, and so we see a lot of leaders that aren't finishing well because of those barriers. And it's not, you come up with your own list if you want to do the Bible study, but we've got all that stuff. And one of the questions I was during the spiritual exercise we were doing a little while ago. This is one, what are you thinking about? What do you, that question on where you at? One of the things I'm thinking a lot about these days is finishing well. And I'm asking myself, what does it look like? I turned 65 in a couple days. And like Lou, I'm a lot closer to the end than I am to the beginning. And, I would hate after this much time of working so hard to walk with God to mess it up at the very end. I really don't want to mess it up. And so I'm thinking a lot about finishing well, and what does finishing well look like? And so that's something that's preoccupying my own thoughts at this time. And then another question that we asked, and this is what we work on a lot when I come to Lou's group, is, well, what can we do about it? You do this big study and you see, hey, there's not very many that finish well. That's a huge warning for us. We see why leaders don't finish well, but what can we do about it? And this is where I think we can do some things that are really helpful. And it's when you talk about use the word a lot, I noticed in the stuff you sent me, holistic work with leaders. How do you help them in every part come into a place of health and well-being and longevity and all these kind of things? We developed a list of 6 things that we call it the enhancements, things that will enhance leaders' chances of finishing well. And so when we talk about those things, there's 2 that I want to mention today. One is coming alongside leaders and giving them perspective, helping them work through their journey with God. And this is something that we do, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's in a retreat setting, whether it's in a one-on-one, whatever it is, we help leaders. And this is what I do all the time. And just walking them through a whole bunch of tools we developed to help leaders process their story. For younger generations, it's not as easy and fast because they don't like being invited into a process or a journey. They want an app that gives them 3 easy buttons to push and that all the answers come out. And this is not how God works. And so we invite them into this journey of discovery and walk with them and help them. And so this one of giving people perspective, I don't know how many leaders around the world we've helped now. We don't really count. Someone asked me that question. I have no idea, all the people, but I know that there's been hundreds of thousands at a minimum we've come alongside and helped along the way. And then we've developed a whole team of practitioners that are out there doing this thing. So I don't know how many they're touching, but trying to give this leadership perspective. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing you've already talked about, and I loved it. I got to get these six things from PastorServe on the kind of people needed in your life, because we talk about mentoring as one of the major things that we can get involved in along the way to really help leaders. And so we do a lot of training on mentoring and how it works and what makes it effective, and how to find mentors and how to be a good mentor and all kinds of stuff we've done along the way on mentoring. And so these things are kind of what I'm focusing on most of the time these days is mentoring and coaching, and also doing a lot of teaching on giving people these perspectives on leadership emergence. So I'm just going to stop there and let Lou talk a little bit, because he's had this experience with me in other settings, or we can go into questions. If I don't know, Lou, you want to add anything? That's as fast a summary as I can do for 40 years of ministry. Oops.
You're muted still, Lou.
Lou. Yep.
Let me share something that was added that happened this morning. We have I had it. We have my denomination is IPHC, and we have a Facebook page, and this pastor posted, here it is. It listed as anonymous, didn't put his name down. At what junction does one give up the fight and leave the ministry? How much blatant disregard should a pastor have to face before God will move them? I completely understand why the number of ministers who are throwing in the towel and walking away from their call just to save themselves from constant barrage of insults from those in the church that call themselves Christians. How many more Sunday nights will I come after pouring everything that the Holy Spirit has given me to share his message and feel as if it was a complete waste of time since it seemingly falls on deaf ears? How much more of a failure will I become before I give it up and walk away? How much more before? That was a pretty interesting comment there. Some people have chimed in on it. One of the things that I think I will chime in, when I grew up, and part of my life was in Alabama as a youngster, and there was a little rural area, and they would use the phrase of a certain person. They would say they were off making a lawyer or off making a preacher. What a phrase, off making. As if, you go to school for a little bit and it's done. And Richard, I thought I would mention that, but then talk about your dad, the making of a leader. It is not an easy process. And whatever this pastor is going through, it's just part of who God's doing to make him into a pastor that will be a follower of him. And some way I want to relate to him. Aren't you glad that Christ did not yield to the temptation when he wasn't appreciated and accepted?
Yeah.
Wow. So I don't know what that added to, but that's just what I saw this morning. Richard is someone obviously struggling. But it's the process. He's in a process. And, we're having a number of friends and people, pastors that are dying recently. And I'm just so impacted by it. It takes a long time to make a quality pastor. It doesn't happen overnight. We have to go through experiences of life and trusting in God and yielding over and over and over. And then when we lose those people, you don't replace them. Don't replace easily. So that's the passion where I am this morning, Richard. I'm not sure what it added to what you're saying. Yeah.
Back in the early 90s, we were invited to go out. My dad and I, my dad was invited. He dragged me along to go out to the headquarters of Lou's group, the International. And we taught in their first graduate program, and that they were running in the school there. And it was so interesting. We'd never been around Pentecostal Holiness Church. We'd never been around a lot of the style of church they had. And when we started talking about God's process of shaping leaders and developing leaders, it was like we were speaking a foreign language to them. But one of the interesting things that happened through that, and Lou, you can comment on this, is there was about 30 leaders in that first class. And many of them have come back. And I met a lot of them when I was working together with Lou and his Thrive for Ministry. A lot of them are now, toward the end, they're toward the end of themselves. And they were so deeply transformed through that experience. And that was really a blessing to be around them, to see how, the perspectives that we were giving them shaped and helped them, and they're still in the game. And that was really meaningful, Lou, the last time we were together. Well, maybe I may have some of you ask any questions you have.
Shall we take about 30 seconds and just kind of absorb what we've heard? And then maybe we could use the chat to ask questions so that everybody can see them. And Richard, you can just kind of answer the ones you want to.
I will try to.
Would that work?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Lord, we just ask even right now that you would begin to help us process what we've heard, that we would have those questions that you want us to know begin to bubble up. We just wait quietly.
Yeah, that first question.
Go ahead and repeat the question for the
question
recording.
is, what are the early warning signs of a coming leader crash? And, that's, I don't know that you could boil it down to, the same symptom, but there are some tendencies you definitely see. When there's, for example, one of the symptoms is confusion. When there's a lot of confusion about what's going on, and you'll see people asking a lot of times, why is this happening, or why isn't that happening, depending on the scenario. And there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of questions about where God is and what God is doing. That's what's part of it causing the confusion. And we've developed lists of things that you say in the if I'm going to simplify it, in the early season of formation, I talk about early, middle, and end to break it down into very simple things. In the early, there's a lot of things that come up surrounding some very common themes, and so you watch for those things. But in the early season, for example, there's two big issues that often cause a lot of the problems, and if you're paying attention, you'll see the symptoms there. One is how you handle relationships with people that are different than you. And so, especially when conflict arises, when criticism happens, those are how leaders respond to those things. Often can be symptomatic of there's a crash coming. And that's closely related to a second big issue is learning to relate to authority. This is a big one, especially in the early development of leaders. They don't usually have a lot of authority, and so they're having to submit to authority a lot, and that can cause a lot of problems. And God there's a lot of things God has to do to teach us to submit to his authority and to submit to other authority in whatever context we're in. So one of the things I watch for in the early season, I'm watching for how people are handling the relational things. Those, if I see some of those things, you can help head them off, or if you see issues relating to authority. And then the third thing is that what causes burnout, if you watch the phenomenology of burnout, most leaders burn out when they lose track of what it is that God's asked them to do and how much they try to take on themselves. And leaders burn out when they're trying to do things that God never asked them to do, or that's usually the problem, is they haven't learned how to really obey, and so they come up with a lot of things. So that often leads to burnout. So you're watching for that, and so that's something in the early and the middle stages. There's different things that cause a lot of pressure for leaders, and you watch. It's a whole area. We have this whole leadership vocabulary, but one of the things you really have to watch, especially in the middle seasons of life, is what we call the social base. We call it social based processing is the official title, but it has to do with the whole network out of which a leader operates, and how are they getting the needs that every human being has met? Are they doing it in a healthy, God-honoring way, or are they, trying to do it in another way? And so that's something to really watch out for. And so there's a lot of things. I just finished 2 weeks ago. I was helping out in a retreat down in Charleston. Great retreat. It's called the Old Dudes Retreat, and it's a bunch of pastors and leaders. It's only men because of the way the retreat's set up. And it's all who are either just turned their churches over and are stepping toward retirement, or they've recently done it. And what I do there is I help give them perspective on how to navigate the challenges of what leaders go through in the end seasons of development. And boy, there's a bunch of unique questions and issues that come up at the end. So helping leaders there. So that's a little bit of a quick thing in terms of watching for those crashes. But most of us can see how people handle time, how they handle relationships, and how they, do they have balance in their lives. Those are the things you're looking for. Anything out of balance is symptomatic of a crash. Too much conflict is symptomatic of a crash. And, and then fatigue is often, a big indicator as well. They're not taking care of themselves and learning to Sabbath and all that other stuff you talk about all the time. That can be, especially for younger people. Another question, are there any practices to learn to notice what God is doing in real time? Maybe you can add, I'm not sure I understand exactly what that question is.
You had a phrase that you said something about noticing what God is doing in real time. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
how can I practice that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is being aware of the process of how God develops leaders. So it's just simply understanding will give you an awareness. And once you have that awareness, you will see it all over the place. Say, for example, character formation. How does God develop a person's character? How does God develop godly character in a person? And once you understand the ways he does it, and again, we've defined all this stuff and written it all out, then you're sensitive to it all around you. So for example, God most likely uses these little things most often, what we call little checks or little tests, and take it in whatever area. Humility, you take it in obedience, you can take it in faith, you can take it in integrity. He brings about little situations where he checks to see, are we going to maintain integrity or not? Are we going to be obedient or not? Are we going to be humble or not? And so once you understand how God uses people, circumstances, situations to shape and form our character, which is a major part of the first 10 to 12 years of ministry. It never stops, but that's where it's really in focus. Then you see them all around. You will see, oh, that's an integrity check. Oh, that's an obedience check. Oh, that's a humility check. And so that's how the awareness comes. Now, for me, as I'm sitting here and I'm looking at each one of you on the little screen there, I can kind of tell by the age you're all about and about where you are. I already could be real prophetic and start to say, hey, how's this going in your life, and how's that going? And because I can tell about what just because I've seen so many the patterns over time, how God uses time. I know about when things happen. Now I can't spell out the specific things that are happening, but I can tell you, these are the things that happen during this season. And so, for example, when someone gets toward the middle end of the middle, so say, and sometimes that's around 40-ish, in the 40s sometimes, God, every time he will take leaders through this, it's kind of a thing to do with competency, where he brings about some crises that test our whether we're going to rely on ourselves or are we going to go back to being reliant on him. And this happens because it's part of God's process to set leaders up for the end season. You know, they won't be able to step into the end season if they keep just relying on their own competency. They have to go back. And the temptation is when you become competent, you tend to rely on it. So if you've been preaching for 20 something years, you can hardly remember those first years when you were desperately saying, God, if you don't come and do thus and so, it's not going to happen. And we're completely, totally dependent. And then after we've done it for some years, we become pretty good at it. You know what I mean? And that's true in every ministry skill area. And so God does that, for example. So once you realize what God does, about when God does it, you become aware in real time. You'll see it in your own life, and you'll see it in people all around you. So that's kind of what we do. We train people how to do that. The best way to do it is do it in your own life. Do work this stuff out in your own life, and then you'll learn it better.
Jeff has a question that he needs to develop vocally.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think our mandate, our sort of coming together piece is sort of the integration of being attentive mental health and how that integrates to contributing to perhaps the well-being and resilience of pastors. And so I know for myself, as a generally emotionally repressed person, that it was my introduction to the life map stuff, you know, Terry Walling, David Zimmerman, Gary Mays, all the CRM guys, you know, applying a lot of your dad's stuff. That I remember thinking it was the first time where I actually had to pay attention to like my emotions. I remember the care with which facilitators were aware that with my pink Post-it notes, I might be talking about traumatic events.
Yes.
And so I guess the question I'm trying to figure out is, how do you frame mental health, right? And how do you see the work that you do? What can we learn from the work that you do that we might be able to apply to contributing mental health for the pastors that we work with?
Yeah.
Or you can answer whatever you want, but that's just.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the funny thing is my dad would also say he's one of those people very similar to you. I don't know if he'd recognize an emotion if it slapped him across the face sometimes. When I was growing up, it felt that way anyway. And but what happened very quickly when you start working in the lives of people, you run into the mess. You run into the formation issues, the childhood issues, the family of origin issues. All that stuff influences who we are and how we respond to life. And so we very quickly recognized in helping people process God's shaping in their lives that an important piece of that is their emotional health, their social health, their mental health. We didn't focus as much on the mental health, but what we realized very quickly was that we needed to lean on the professionals, so to say, those of you who have been trained in all of those areas. And so what we would do is we would, as things came up in the life of helping someone process a trauma or whatever, we would say, hey, you know, we need to help you find someone, you know, who understands the dynamics of these kind of scenarios that can help you process it. You know, so we tried to work integratively that system, you know, with all of the different and part of it's the way the School of World Mission was, you know, at Fuller Seminary. There was also a School of Psychology, so there was always this awareness that there was the need for balance, and so that's. I don't have a great answer except to recognizing how important it is.
Yeah.
Jeff.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, for myself, I would say that just realizing that I might be in stage 3 versus stage 4,
Yeah,
in developmental theory was alone enough to alleviate a tremendous amount of guilt and
yeah.
shame and disappointment, as an Enneagram 3 trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, just the framework and the anticipation of the bridge being out around the corner is marvelous. I mean, that I would say in many ways opened the door for me to realize that there are places of emotional health, psychological well-being that I didn't have language for, but just open the door.
Yeah,
I guess what I'd be interested in is knowing, and I completely understand like the handoff with
yeah,
professionals that would be able to, MFTs and this sort of thing, dealing with attachment theory and these sorts, would be great. Yeah, so all that to say, deeply marvelous in terms of the work that you guys are up to, Richard. And best practices, hints, tips, how do you find good people to refer to, what do you look for, those sorts of things would all be valuable at some point.
yeah.
I would love to hear that.
When we develop people across our timeline, most North Americans think it's a race to try to get to the end. One of the end development phases we used to call convergence, and that's when everything comes together and you're operating at your peak. Every CRMer wanted to be there by 32. I mean, that's just the way it was. And they all thought they were there. They didn't realize they were just getting toward the end of the beginning. And so we often had to reshape people's understanding of how God works over a lifetime. And that, like you said, it can take off a tremendous amount of pressure.
Mm.
Now, for me personally, I had, because I was working in a vineyard context, I had a lot of work in inner healing, helping people get connected to God and ministry prayer and all that kind of stuff. So I would always incorporate that as well, not in place of the professional, so to say, but to get them moving in the right tracks. And so that's another thing I use. Lou, looks like you have
I find it really interesting personally that the privilege of leading the Thriving in Ministry program, which now I'm in the, I think, 6th year of this. I was the initiator of our program, planned the first one, and now the second one. So I will have almost 10 years that this is what I have been doing. And I feel like I have I'm 75 now, so I would started when I was 70. I feel like I have found where I need to be in service of Christ.
Convergence.
At age 70, it
yeah, we would
is.
call it that. By the way, now we use a different word. We talk about a focused life instead of convergence was too complicated for people. So
So I like updated language.
yeah, that's my job is to interpret my dad. Basically, that's what I do. Change all the language.
We've got about 6 minutes left. If any other questions are starting to bubble up, and anyone else, everyone's open to asking. You don't have to do it in the chat. You can just do it live if it's easier.
I was wondering your input about we deal with a lot of pastors that they are well prepared theologically, but not ready or and I work, of course, as a Latino context. In my case, we have our beautiful tags, our beautiful certificates, my master's degree in theology. I guess that's part of my story after burnout, still recovering, right? But they are not only aware, which will be beautiful if you're at least aware of your wounds and your humanity. But they're not open yet to explore that part of you, of course. And I was wondering what's your approach when you walk with men or women in ministry, and we celebrate all those your story, that's great. But you are more than that. Now we know that, of course.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work all over. I don't even know the right word. Hispanic world, all over Central and South America. Two of my dad's closest mentorees. One was in Ecuador for 25 years, and another is Peruvian. So we've worked all over done some work with them. One thing that we found absolutely crucial in the Hispanic world was to make sure that we postured ourselves as coming alongside. Because of the hierarchy issues in the culture that can cause some problems, that was the starting point. We tried to build a bridge of coming alongside, communicating in as many ways as we could. Hey, we are one of you who's on the same journey. And that there were some cultural things, machismo, all the other stuff that you have to deal with that's unique to some of those cultural settings. But what we found was once you break through the initial barriers and create different expectations, in other words, you're not about your job title, you're not about your certificate yet, that's not your story. Your story is this journey with God, how God is working in your life. Once we could get to there, then it was easy. Then it opened up the whole way to talk about everything else. And but there are some challenges in the culture. So I know where you're coming from. The biggest, when I talked about those barriers that block leaders from finishing well, I mean, one of the biggest ones we found in the Hispanic world was what we call busyness, the tyranny of the urgent, the tendency to we called it to wear too many hats. Every leader was being pulled from 5 different directions all the time. And the burnout rates were super high, and the dropout rates were very high as well. So we worked a lot on the spiritual formation side of things, just helping them learn how to get connected to God, be centered, etc. These kind of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
All hearts clear? All right, well, let's pray and we'll get you guys on your way. Lord, thank you for this time you've set aside as holy to bring us together as a group, to resource us for our pastors, for your pastors, or that we could care for them well through their whole ministry longevity, or that they would be healthy. Lord, I bless each one of these men and women as they go about their day, or that you would continue to bubble up those things that you want us to remember, to look further into, that would be of help to ourselves and to our pastors. In Jesus' name, amen.